In September 1939, Canada's Navy possessed 13 ships and 3,500 personnel. No capacity to build modern warships, no expertise in naval combat, no infrastructure for oceanic warfare. By May 1945, Canada operated 373 warships crewed by 110,000 sailors and had escorted more than 25,000 merchant ship voyages across the Atlantic, delivering 165 million tons of cargo that kept Britain fighting and made the liberation of Europe possible. The transformation happened in 4 years through a single decision: build cheap, build simple, build many. The vessel that made it possible was the Flower-class corvette, a 205-foot commercial whaler design adapted for wartime emergency production. Cost per ship, roughly $550,000 Canadian dollars. Construction time, 8 to 12 months in yards that had never built a warship before. Total built, 123 corvettes that became the backbone of the Atlantic convoy system. This is the arithmetic of industrial mobilization, how Canada turned commercial shipyards into naval arsenals and proved that adequate ships in overwhelming numbers could win the longest battle of the war. The crisis was immediate and existential. Britain needed supplies from North America to survive. Germany's U-boats would try to sink every ship carrying those supplies. The Royal Navy possessed destroyers for convoy escort, but not nearly enough. Building fleet destroyers required sophisticated yards, turbine machinery, advanced fire control systems, capabilities that Canadian shipyards did not possess and could not acquire quickly. The British Admiralty's solution was brutal pragmatism. Design the simplest possible anti-submarine escort that could be built in any commercial yard capable of launching a fishing vessel. In January 1939, Smith's Dock Company in Middlesbrough received the specification: create a patrol vessel based on the Southern Pride whale catcher, make it 205 feet long to allow higher speed, use 2 marine oil-fired boilers because they could be delivered in 16 weeks, instead of the 7 months required for water tube boilers. Install a single-screw triple-expansion steam engine producing 2,750 horsepower, ancient technology that any merchant marine engineer would understand. Arm it with a single 4-inch gun forward, depth charges aft, and ASDIC for detecting submerged submarines. Maximum speed, 16 knots in calm seas. Range, 3,500 nautical miles at 12 knots. Displacement, 950 tons. The result was designated HMS Gladiolus, lead ship of the Flower class. First Sea Lord Winston Churchill reportedly called them cheap and nasties. The name was accurate. They cost roughly £50,000 to build in Britain, about 1/10 the cost of a fleet destroyer, and they were miserable to serve in. Canada's decision to build corvettes was driven by mathematical necessity rather than naval ambition. In early 1940, Britain placed orders for 64 corvettes from Canadian shipyards. The reasoning was simple. Canadian yards couldn't build cruisers or destroyers, but they could build corvettes. The design specifications were deliberately chosen to match Canada's industrial capacity. Every shipyard on the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence, the Atlantic and Pacific coasts could handle the work. The hulls were 205 feet long, short enough to fit through the St. Lawrence locks before the seaway was built, ensuring Great Lakes yards could participate. The machinery was commercial standard triple-expansion engines, not sophisticated turbines. The construction techniques were merchant scantlings, the same methods used for building freighters. No specialized naval expertise required. Kingston shipyards, which hadn't built anything since 1923, received contracts for 4 corvettes and completed them on schedule. Port Arthur Shipbuilding on Lake Superior built corvettes that were finished in winter, stored on blocks until spring breakup, then sent down the St. Lawrence for final fitting out and commissioning. Davy Shipbuilding in Quebec, Collingwood shipyards in Ontario, Victoria Machinery Depot in British Columbia, yards scattered across 3,000 miles of Canadian geography all began launching corvettes by late 1940. The economics were deliberately accessible. The early models cost approximately $530,000 to build in eastern yards, $600,000 on the west coast, where materials had to travel further. Compare this to HMCS Saguenay, one of Canada's pre-war destroyers built in Britain for £500,000, roughly 2.4 million Canadian dollars at 1939 exchange rates. For the cost of one destroyer, Canada could build 4 corvettes. The corvette required 8 to 12 months from keel laying to commissioning versus 18 to 24 months for a destroyer. Most importantly, corvettes could be built in parallel across dozens of yards simultaneously. Canada's shipbuilding capacity in 1939 couldn't produce a single modern destroyer. That same capacity could produce 60 corvettes simultaneously. The government did the arithmetic. Britain needed escorts immediately in overwhelming numbers. Perfect ships delivered slowly wouldn't save convoys. Adequate ships delivered quickly in quantity might. Canada ordered 64 corvettes in the 1939 to 1940 program, then 43 more in subsequent years, eventually reaching 107 corvettes built in Canadian yards. Another 16 were built in Britain for Canadian service. Total 123 corvettes commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy, plus additional vessels built for the Royal Navy and US Navy under Lend-Lease arrangements. The ships were deliberately minimalist. Early Flower-class corvettes displaced 950 tons, 1/8 the size of a fleet destroyer. They mounted a single 4-inch BL Mark 9 gun forward, capable of firing a 31-pound shell at surface targets or aircraft. Secondary armament consisted of 2.50 caliber machine guns and depth charges as the primary anti-submarine weapon. Later variants added 20mm Oerlikon cannons and eventually Hedgehog forward-throwing mortars, but early corvettes relied almost entirely on depth charges dropped from stern racks or fired from throwers. ASDIS provided underwater detection out to about 1,500 yards in good conditions, though underwater thermal layers in the North Atlantic often rendered it useless. The corvettes carried 70 depth charges initially, later increased to 120 as the war progressed. They had no sophisticated fire control systems, no advanced radar until 1941, no modern communications equipment. What they had was seaworthiness and numbers. The whale catcher hull design proved extraordinarily capable in heavy seas. They would roll on wet grass according to sailors' descriptions, but they stayed afloat in Atlantic storms that sent larger ships running for port. The human cost of this economy was measured in misery. A corvette's crew numbered 85 officers and ratings in quarters designed for perhaps 60. The short forecastle meant waves crashed directly onto the deck, flooding the forward mess deck with freezing seawater in rough weather. The well deck ahead of the bridge created a wet ship that kept crews constantly soaked. Heating was minimal. Ventilation was inadequate. In winter Atlantic gales, crews spent days chipping ice from superstructures to prevent top heaviness that could capsize the ship. Food was monotonous. Canned rations, stale bread, tea strong enough to dissolve spoons. Sleep was impossible during depth charge attacks. The triple expansion engine's vibration made the entire hull shake. The single shaft and 3-blade propeller meant no redundancy. If the engine failed, the ship was dead in the water. Maximum speed of 16 knots meant U-boats running on the surface at 18 knots could outrun them. In calm seas, corvettes were adequate anti-submarine platforms. In moderate seas, their speed dropped to 12 knots. In heavy weather, they made perhaps 8 knots, while destroyers could still manage 20. These were not ships designed for crew comfort or tactical perfection. They were ships designed for mass production and adequate performance. The production tempo revealed Canada's industrial transformation. The first corvette commissioned was HMCS Collingwood in November 1940. By the end of 1941, 37 more had entered service. By 1942, corvettes were being commissioned at a rate of 3 per month. Canadian yards that had built nothing larger than fishing trawlers were launching 950-ton warships. The distributed production meant no single Luftwaffe raid could cripple Canada's corvette program. Kingston shipyards built 12 corvettes. Collingwood built 18. Marine Industries in Sorel, Quebec built 17. Yarrows in Victoria built 8. Morton Engineering in Quebec City built 5. Even small yards contributed single ships. The construction was economical because it was simple. Weld steel plates into a hull, install a commercial engine, bolt on a gun, and depth charges. A competent commercial yard could do it. The bottleneck wasn't construction, it was crew training. Manning 123 corvettes required roughly 10,000 trained sailors. Canada's entire pre-war regular navy numbered 3,500. The solution was the Royal Canadian Naval Reserve and Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve, merchant sailors, fishermen, civilians given basic training and sent to sea in corvettes. Many had never seen the ocean before enlisting. They learned navigation, gunnery, depth charge procedures, and anti-submarine warfare while escorting actual convoys with actual U-boats hunting them. The strategic deployment maximized Canadian capacity while acknowledging limitations. In mid-1941, Britain asked Canada to assume responsibility for escort duty in the Western Atlantic, from Canadian ports to Iceland, where British escort groups would take over for the run to Britain. The Newfoundland Escort Force was established with Canadian corvettes forming its core. 6 destroyers and 17 corvettes were assembled at St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada's forward base for Atlantic operations. The duty was grueling. Escort a convoy from Halifax to Iceland, about 2,000 miles, refuel, pick up a westbound convoy, escort it back to Canada, refuel, repeat. The cycle ran continuously, regardless of weather, equipment failures, or crew exhaustion. Corvettes designed for coastal patrols were now doing mid-ocean escort work in the worst seas on Earth. They weren't ideal for the role. They were simply all that existed in adequate numbers. By early 1942, Canadian corvettes were escorting approximately 40% of all Atlantic convoys. The contribution wasn't measured in tactical brilliance or technological sophistication. It was measured in merchant ships that arrived intact because a corvette was present to drop depth charges when a U-boat attacked, even if the corvette never hit anything. The Battle of the Atlantic tested Canada's corvettes brutally. In September 1941, convoy SC-42 was attacked by a wolf pack of 16 U-boats. The escort consisted of a single destroyer and 3 corvettes, inadequate by any measure. The U-boats sank 16 merchant ships over 3 days, while the corvettes dropped depth charges frantically, often missing because ASDIC contact was lost in the North Atlantic's thermal layers. In October 1940, convoy SC-7 lost 20 ships in 3 days, despite corvette escorts fighting desperately to protect them. The problem wasn't courage, it was arithmetic. 3 corvettes couldn't defend 35 merchant ships spread over several square miles of ocean against coordinated attacks by multiple submarines. The solution wasn't better corvettes, it was more corvettes. By 1943, the standard convoy escort consisted of 6 to 8 corvettes plus 2 or 3 destroyers. The numerical superiority meant U-boats faced depth charge attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Even if individual corvettes missed their targets, the cumulative threat forced U-boats to dive and lose contact with convoys. Adequate ships in overwhelming numbers created saturation defense. The combat record reveals both limitations and effectiveness. Canadian corvettes participated in sinking or sharing credit for 33 U-boats during the war, not a spectacular total compared to the roughly 1,000 U-boats destroyed by all Allied forces. But sinking U-boats was never the primary mission. The mission was delivering merchant ships intact. In that metric, Canadian corvettes succeeded overwhelmingly. More than 25,000 merchant ship voyages were escorted by Canadian forces during the war, predominantly by corvettes. The loss rate was roughly 1%, meaning 99% of escorted ships arrived safely. Compare this to the chaos of 1942, when U-boats in American waters sank nearly 400 ships in 7 months because no convoy system existed. Organized convoys with adequate escorts, even minimalist corvette escorts, reduced losses by an order of magnitude. The arithmetic was brutal. Britain needed 700,000 tons of imports monthly to sustain the war effort. Each sunken 7,000-ton merchantman meant 100 fewer tanks or 1,000 fewer tons of aviation fuel reaching British ports. Every merchant ship that arrived because a corvette scared off a U-boat contributed to Britain's survival. The corvette's contribution wasn't heroic individual actions. It was the cumulative effect of thousands of convoy escorts month after month in weather that would have kept more sophisticated ships in port. The technical evolution showed pragmatic adaptation. Original Flower-class corvettes had a short forecastle ending just past the bridge, creating the notorious wet well deck. Modified Flower-class from 1941 onward extended the forecastle aft to the funnel, creating an enclosed deck and raising the bridge one level. This dramatically improved seakeeping and crew habitability. Radar was added beginning in 1941. First, the primitive SW-1C and SW-2C sets, later the vastly superior Type 2 7.1 centimetric radar that could detect surfaced U-boats at 5,000 yards. Hedgehog forward-throwing mortars were installed from 1943, allowing corvettes to maintain ASDIC contact while attacking instead of losing contact when passing over the target to drop stern depth charges. 20mm Oerlikon cannons were added to counter the growing threat of German aircraft. Later, Canadian-built corvettes incorporated these improvements from construction. HMCS Sackville, commissioned in December 1941, was still built to original specifications. HMCS Louisburg, commissioned in February 1943, was modified standard from launch. The modifications increased displacement to 1,015 tons and cost perhaps $650,000, but they made corvettes more effective and slightly less miserable to serve in. The human accounting was grimmer. 10 Canadian corvettes were lost during the war, 7 to U-boat torpedoes, 1 to aircraft, 1 to collision, 1 to mine. HMCS Charlottetown was torpedoed in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in September 1942, sinking in 4 minutes with only 8 survivors from her crew of 64. HMCS Spikenard went down in 5 minutes mid-Atlantic in February 1942 after a torpedo hit, only 8 survivors from 57 crew. HMCS Louisburg struck a mine off Tunisia in February 1943 with 40 killed. HMCS Alberni was torpedoed off France in August 1944. HMCS Regina was torpedoed in the English Channel in August 1944. Each loss was roughly 60 sailors dead, small compared to a battleship's complement, catastrophic for a small ship's close-knit crew. Survivors described the horror of depth charges exploding around them in the water after their corvette sank, the underwater pressure waves rupturing organs. Others froze to death in minutes in North Atlantic water. The 10 corvettes lost represented less than 10% of Canada's corvette fleet, acceptable losses in wartime accounting, devastating in human terms for the families in Charlottetown, Spikenard, Louisburg, and 110 other Canadian towns whose namesake ships never came home. By 1943, Canada's corvettes formed the numerical backbone of the Allied escort fleet. Of roughly 150 escorts operating in the North Atlantic, approximately 70 were Canadian corvettes. Britain supplied destroyers and frigates. The United States contributed destroyer escorts, but Canada provided the mass, the adequate ships in overwhelming quantity that made convoy defense mathematically viable. Each convoy of 40 to 50 merchant ships required 6 to 8 escorts to provide saturation coverage. If those escorts weren't available, convoys sailed with minimal protection or didn't sail at all. Canada's 123 corvettes meant convoy sailings could continue regardless of losses, equipment failures, or maintenance requirements. There were always enough corvettes available because Canada had built enough corvettes. The arithmetic was simple but profound. Britain needed 100 escorts operational simultaneously. If each escort spent 1 month at sea and 1 month in port for maintenance, the Navy needed 200 escorts in inventory. If 20% were damaged or under major refit at any time, the requirement grew to 250 escorts. Canada alone provided roughly half that number from corvette production. The industrial legacy proved Canada's transformation was permanent. In 1939, Canadian shipyards employed perhaps 4,000 workers and produced fishing vessels. By 1943, Canadian yards employed 126,000 workers and built warships, freighters, and merchant vessels simultaneously. The Corvette program alone generated 107 completed warships in 4 years, an average of 1 corvette every 2 weeks from Canadian yards collectively. The skills learned building corvettes transferred to more sophisticated vessels. From 1943 onward, Canadian yards began building River-class frigates, larger, more capable anti-submarine escorts displacing 1,400 tons with better sensors and weapons. By war's end, Canadian yards had delivered 70 frigates in addition to the corvettes. The economic multiplier was enormous. Shipyard workers paid taxes, bought houses, supported local businesses. The steel industry expanded to provide plate. The machinery industry grew to supply engines and boilers. Cities like Halifax, Sydney, Quebec City, Victoria boomed from naval construction contracts. When the war ended, Canada possessed not just a large navy, but an established shipbuilding industry capable of constructing modern warships. The final accounting was written in merchant ships that arrived. Of the 25,000-plus merchant ship voyages escorted by Canadian forces, approximately 165 million tons of cargo reached Britain, enough to sustain British resistance through the darkest years and build up forces for D-Day. Those cargoes included 2 million vehicles, 5 million tons of ammunition, 25 million tons of petroleum products, and enough food to feed Britain's population when submarine warfare nearly starved the nation into surrender. Every ton that arrived was carried in a merchant ship that survived because an escort was present. Many of those escorts were Canadian corvettes that cost $550,000, were built in 8 months by commercial yards, and were crewed by former fishermen and civilians who learned seamanship by doing it. The arithmetic is simple but definitive. Canada built 123 corvettes for roughly $70 million total. Those corvettes helped deliver $50 billion worth of cargo at 1945 prices. The return on investment was 700 to 1. Britain stayed in the war. The invasion of Europe succeeded. Germany was defeated, and Canada's corvettes, designed as cheap emergency escorts expected to last perhaps 2 years, became the industrial foundation of victory in the longest battle of the Second World War. HMCS Sackville remains preserved in Halifax as Canada's naval memorial, the last Flower-class corvette in existence, representative of the 122 others that proved adequate ships in overwhelming numbers could accomplish what perfect ships in limited quantity never could.